watching Between Parks Place and Capitol Hill on Six News, a show all about law and government in Australia. I'm your host, Stuart Jeffrey, and joining me today is our parliamentary reporter, Aidan Edgecombe, and our international correspondent, Elijah Granite, to discuss the Crown. This was meant to come out around the coronation time. Unfortunately, we've been delayed, but we're finally getting around to doing it. This was a topic that we'll come back to plenty of times, I'm sure, over the coming year. We've got plenty of anniversaries to cover. Federation Day comes up in July, so we've definitely got some stuff to look at later on, but this is a basic introduction to the Crown and the division of said Crown. Elijah, could you just briefly go over some of the history there in why the Crown has so much power to begin with, just to start us off?
Absolutely. So the starting point of the Crown is it is the place of sovereignty, the place of actual political power. It is the essence of what was inherited into English law from the idea of the Romans, of imperium, of dominion over the land. So the starting point for the Crown is to some extent one of absolutism, and the history of England and then Australia and also the rest of the Commonwealth and indeed the United States is chipping away at that absolutism. But it does start with this idea of imperium taken from the Romans, this idea of dominion completely in temporal matters and the governance of the realm. And in fact, with the separation of the Church of England, it becomes supreme in spiritual matters as well. And so you really do have the entirety of the state, its personification and legitimate power bound up in this concept we call the Crown, and then bound into the person of the king. And so it's this odd thing where the single person is also the entirety of the state. And working out this weird concept and what to do with it is the dialogue that illustrates essentially the last 1,000 years of the law.
So in that sense, would you say that probably like the Magna Carta would be the foundation of the Crown in English law, or does it go back further than that?
The Magna Carta is fairly important in that it establishes the limitations of the Crown. It establishes that the Crown is not above the law, but it may even go back further in that we have from the earliest sort of sources of even pre-Norman kings this idea of limitation, this idea of law limiting it. And even again, if you go back to the Romans, there's back and forth on to what extent imperium relates to the law and is the Crown above the law. But Magna Carta is sort of the classical starting point because it is where the Crown first accepts that it has obligations under the law and that the Crown is, in that sense, not simply absolutist, but one part of the system. So the Magna Carta is a very useful starting point.
Okay, so let's fast forward 600 years and we'll get to Australia and the arrival of the British in Australia. Was that system then carried over to us in 1788 and onwards?
It was. So incorrectly, Australia was regarded as a settled colony, that is to say, a place that was empty and then where English law simply arrived and assumed complete law. Obviously, that was not factually correct. There were people here, and indeed there was traditional law, and indeed, actually, in some of the colonial records, the early times, there is even some record of indigenous law being recognized as customary law. But the thrust of legal history was that Australia essentially was regarded in the way colonies were regarded as being an empty land that was settled, and therefore where English law simply landed with English settlers. So once the colonies were first established in Australia, Australia essentially became an offshoot of English law and subject to the Crown and taking on all that history. And that's why, as strange as it is, Australian legal history includes these things that happened on the other side of the world hundreds of years before Europeans ever arrived.
Is this also true for other British colonies and India or Canada, for example, or were they treated differently?
So some of them were treated the same. But in others, they were treated as, for example, ceded, and there was some recognition of existing customary law. So this was certainly the case in Africa. It was to some extent the case in New Zealand, and has been to some extent rediscovered more recently. There's always been the idea that existing law where a colony is ceded or conquered is preserved. And so, for example, there's a lot of jurisprudence about African customary law in the various African colonies. On the other hand, in Canada, for example, accepting treaties that were often ignored, in many cases, law was carried over. In Canada, the most prominent example of laws coexisting is actually from the French settlement pre-existing in Quebec, which then came to coexist. But what's worth emphasizing for purposes of these discussions is that even in these cases where English law did not immediately displace all the existing law, the public law, and specifically the law pertaining to the crown, was always assumed. So no matter what, the crown came in. The only exception would be things like protectorates, where an existing king remained but merely allowed the British to assume its international relations or some of it. But for every colony, the crown was essentially a non-negotiable part of the law that was taken over or forced in basically every case.
And so, given that the monarch held all of these crowns at the same time, is that where we get the notion of the indivisible crown from?
Yes, and the crown is this magical thing. So the crown can do no wrong in law. The crown persists no matter the death of the monarch. It is invested in the heir immediately. So this crown becomes this omnipotent, indivisible thing, which is the one bit uniting all the different bits of the growing colonial empire. And so it becomes very important that His Majesty can both have a legislature in Bermuda, but also a parliament in England, and that these things can be working together. And so this indivisibility of the crown becomes very important to essentially string together this otherwise completely unlinked, because there was, for example, it wasn't as if the early Australian colonists were sending representatives to Parliament, or even if the early governors could have any real active communication in any short period of time with London. So the question became, what links all these things? And the answer became this indivisible crown. And so this legal fiction of a single monarchy being the thing that explains why Canada and New Zealand and Malawi and Scotland are all somehow united, despite the real lack of any other common institutions.
So you spoke about how once the British Empire colonized all these places, it was kind of just assumed that the king in England at the time would be the head of state of that country. So how does it work from a title perspective, but then also a legal perspective? Were you just the king of the British Empire, and you talk about indivisibility, or being the king of all the different separate colonies, and how has that developed over time as countries have gained their independence?
It's a great question. So it starts out just the king of England, and then they start editing these styles and titles to say of the king of Great Britain, Ireland, and the dominions beyond the seas, and the other territories. And then over time, what happens is the increasing autonomy to the various colonial and then the dominion parliaments meant that they start out with the common succession laws in the Act of Settlement from 1701. And then what they do is they slowly, each one, changes the styles and titles. So in Australia, that's the Royal Styles and Titles Act. In Canada, it was recently changed by a small bit in a budgetary bill. And in each case, you have editing and changes. And so it becomes King of Canada and his other realms and territories is the current style. And so slowly those titles branch out. But in truth, the starting point was always the first title was King of Great Britain and then King of the United Kingdom, and everything else was an afterthought.
Before we go into the Australian example, because I know there's some stuff there about the governors versus the Governor General, I have one question for you, because I know this is a question that often gets raised when we're talking about the crown. Can the monarch be convicted of treason?
No. They simply put, there is a maxim in Latin rex non potest peccare, which in English means the king can do no wrong. The king is incapable of committing a crime under the law, and even if the king were, the king couldn't be tried because the judges are representatives of the king. The prosecution is done by the king, and the defense, if they're king's counsel, are the king's own lawyers. Now, this leads to the point, of course, of Charles I, who was put on trial for treason and, in fact, had his head chopped off. The issue with that is that the High Court of Justice set up by Parliament to try Charles I lacked jurisdiction. And while Charles I was a pretty terrible king, he was right at his trial when he brought up the point that the court lacked jurisdiction. And to really emphasize that point, Charles II had the surviving regicides hunted down and killed, and dug up and chopped up the corpses of those who were not surviving. So there's two answers, as there often are in law. Legally, the king cannot be tried for treason. Practically, the king can be tried for treason if you manage to have the military power to seize control of the realm, as Parliament did when they tried Charles I.
So even though the king and the crown are two separate things, the body physical and the corporate body, in this case, in case of treason, they are still the same person, so to speak, legally.
Yes, well, treason is defined in common law as giving aid or comfort or compassing or waging war against the king. And so it would be rather difficult for the king to wage war against himself. And so in that sense, it's very difficult to see how it would even be possible for the king to commit treason, just because, like so many things with the king and the law, it ends up being a bit of self-dealing. If the crown dealing with other parts of the crown, which in theory is the king simply talking to himself.
It's moving back from that to the Australian context, then it's just a fun tangent. I've always been interesting. When we come to the Australian scene, I believe everyone knows the Statute of Westminster in 1942. We separated away, got control of our foreign policy from the UK. They also lost more power over us domestically. What about the states? We know that we have the Governor General at the federal level, and we know we have the governors at the state level. There's also the administrator in the Northern Territory, and the ACT, I believe, is the Governor General. So what's the relationship there between the Governor General, and the Crown? Are they the same thing, or is there some other arrangement there?
No, and they in many ways have two parallel histories. That the colonies that came together to create the Commonwealth continued as colonies. That, of course, was the nature of the bond they made at Federation, was they gave certain powers to the Commonwealth, but in every other respect, they continued to operate as colonies. And what that meant was that even as the Commonwealth, via the various imperial conferences and statutes, became more and more what we would consider to be a country, the states in many ways continued as colonies of the crown, and in that sense had a direct relationship to the monarch, not mediated through the governor general. In that sense, that's part of why, although it's a bit arbitrary, they're called governors of the Australian states, whereas in Canada, where the provinces were always subject to and created by the federal constitution, they were lieutenant governors. They were understudies to the main. The Australian state governors, up until 1986, when the anomalous situation was worked out, in part to stop some fear that it could cause shenanigans or oddities, the states, via both the governors and also the judicial committee of the Privy Council, the body in London that functioned as, in some cases, the final court, were this odd thing of being at once part of the Commonwealth, clearly an independent country, but also subject via the crown, still in some odd way, British subjects. And that is difficult to comprehend, and it makes little sense, but its relevance today in this post-1986 world is that the history of the crown in the States has always been one independent from the crown as vested in the Commonwealth and the king and then the governor general.
Another thing I want to bring up, because I know you mentioned before about the trial of a king in England with King Charles I, is hypothetically the military would have to have enough power to be able to overthrow the king. And now we're talking in an Australian context. I don't know if either of you two are familiar. I've kind of just sprung this, but it popped into my mind. The arrest of William Bligh, who was the governor of New South Wales from, I believe, 1806 to around 1808. And he was overthrown in a military coup, I believe the only time it's happened in Australian history. And he was then arrested by the military. I believe he was released and then went back to England. But how does, from a legal perspective, how does it work then? Because he was the governor, which would then be the king's representative in that regard. So how does it work from a legal perspective, him then being arrested?
I think that on strict legal terms, that was mutiny. I think Bligh had a habit of having people do against him. Not a good leader in general. But the crown is a very practical entity, and the crown tends to sort of accept that at some point, if people aren't willing to bear something, it will go along. That happened in modern terms, most famously with Anguilla, which did not want to become independent, wanted to stay a British territory, did not want to be federated in the Caribbean, and staged essentially a bloodless coup, which was absolutely illegal. But nonetheless, they got to remain a British territory. They got their wish. So that there's a tendency of the crown to be in many ways practical about these things, if only because the crown understands the very hard limit of its powers, and the crown essentially had a choice. Do you try to reimpose William Bligh and have no authority, or send him just packing as far away from possible and try to continue having some authority there?
So even though he represented the king in New South Wales, he could still be arrested, technically, I'm sure
it was illegal.
So if you represent for example, then that means the governor general will have the same immunities that the monarch has when it comes to treason and other criminal offences. Then,
not quite, because there could be, the governor general would have that immunity in the exercise of the king's authority. But the governor general can still, for example, as a person, as an individual, not exercising that office, commit a crime or otherwise do something wrong. That said, it would be very hard, I think, to arrest a governor general. But in theory, a governor general could betray the king, whereas the king cannot betray himself. And that's the weird self-referential backstop of it.
So even though the king has both legal and the body corporate, the executive when it comes to criminal offences, that same freedom isn't given to the Governor General or the governors then?
No, which is a good thing, because the Governor General and the governors sometimes have to get their hands dirty. They have to deal with the rugged bits of politics. And if you think about a lot of times in Australian history, that's been very rough, not only the famous constitutional crisis of the 1970s, but frankly, a lot of crises in the 1930s with Jack Lang in New South Wales. There are a lot of times the governors and the Governor General have had to get their hands dirty. And it's good in that case that they aren't essentially treated as in absolute immune. And frankly, it lets them be better at administering. In the UK, the king, because the king has to deal with things personally, the king becomes very reluctant and everything has to be done by silence, because if the king gets too involved in anything, it becomes impossible because the king is too powerful. The king is immune, and yet the king also cannot be seen to use that power and immunity to stomp on politicians. So it's actually a much better system when the governor generals and governors are able to get involved, because they don't have the same limitations that someone who is the embodiment of the entire state is stuck with.
Just quickly before we wrap up, you mentioned that a governor or a governor general could, in theory, be tried for, say, treason if they went against the kings. Is there a strictly legal sense for that? Or because if you're betraying the crown, and I know we talked about the crown as an individual, but then also as a legal entity. So what would, hypothetically, what would a governor or a governor general have to do to be considered to have betrayed the crown?
Well, for example, let's say the governor general gave the designs for the AUKUS submarines to China.
Okay.
Which to be absolutely clear is not happened, has not happened, will not, entirely hypothetical. That would be treason. And that would be treason against His Majesty and Right of Australia. It would be, yeah, that sort of thing. Or for example, if the Governor General conspired to have China invade Australia, stuff like that would definitely be treason. Whereas if the king did it, it would be grounds in real practical politics. It would be grounds for shooting the king in the way wars work, but it would not be grounds for trying them for treason.
Just one final question to look at. Of course, this doesn't apply to the Northern Territory for the ACT because they're territories. They can't really be considered separate crowns, but is this division of the crown between the federal crown in the Commonwealth, in the Governor General, and the state level governors? Is that why we have two levels of writs for the elections? Is that why Senate elections are given by writs by governors, because they represent the states, whereas our House of Reps is representing the Australian people, so that's the Governor General? Then would that division of the crown play into that separation there at all for the issuing of writs for elections?
It absolutely is. The House of Representatives, like the House of Commons, is designed to be this one great chamber of the entire realm of the entire Commonwealth. It's not a chamber of the states, and so therefore the Electoral Act gives it to the Governor General. Whereas the Senate, of course, is for representing the states, and hence Tasmania having the same number of senators as the big states. And that is sort of the division of it. And it's the issuance of the writs by then the king's representative applicable to it. And so that is a very neat and clear example of the ways in which the Crown in Australia divides between the states and the Commonwealth.
So from us for now, and we'll see you all next time.